Delighted to have with us today Pastor Charlie Drew. He's authored a book entitled Body Broken, Can Republicans and Democrats Sit in the Same Pew? Boy, has he hit the nail on the head with this book. Let me encourage you to check it out. It's a New Growth Press. You can look at it at Amazon and, of course, Barnes & Noble, and you may even want to check it out at Evangel. Pastor Drew, what a delight to have you with us today.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
This is a hot topic. What decided to make you to take this on?
Well, I guess two things. I love the church. I'm a pastor. I love to see the church loving each other. I also care about the world, and I think the church has an obligation to be involved in the world. So it's this twofold issue that's at stake. The subtitle of the book is Can Republicans and Democrats Sit Together in the Same Pew? And the reason I made that the title is I'm trying to answer the question, how can Christians be socially and politically responsible without blowing up the church? And I think it's possible, but it will take a lot of work. And nevertheless, I think it's really strategic. And if you don't mind, I'll tell you why I think it'll take a lot of work and also why it's strategic. May I do that?
Oh, please do. I mean, you're walking right down the path there. Go for it.
Okay. Well, I think it will take a lot of work for two reasons. And I think one of the reasons is a good reason, and the other reason is a bad reason. The good reason is that we care. Mm-hmm. You know, Jesus is the Lord of everything. He isn't just the Lord of our private lives, and he's told us to love our neighbors as ourselves. And if we really do love our neighbors as ourselves, if we passionately do that, which we should, we're bound to end up disagreeing with each other on how to do that best. That's the good reason. Mm-hmm. And I commend Christians everywhere in their efforts to do that. I think there's a bad reason, though, for why we get so upset with each other, and it's the age-old problem of idolatry. Now, let me define idolatry briefly. Idolatry is putting our deepest hopes in anything created, whether it's a particular law or a particular candidate or a particular policy, a particular platform. Idols are fragile, and fragility produces fear, and fear produces anger. So you have this kind of a double whammy. We really care on the one hand, and we're afraid on the other hand because we slip towards idolatry in our social and political efforts to improve things. So that's why it's hard. Now I'll say why it's strategic. It's strategic because I think really the gospel message itself is at stake. If you don't mind, let me just read to you a brief set of verses from Ephesians chapter 4. Paul says at the beginning of that epistle, I therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience bearing with one another in love, eager, and this is what's really significant, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit of the bond of peace, not eager to create it, but to maintain it. There is, Paul goes on to say, one body, one spirit, just as we were called to the one hope that belongs to our call. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of us all. Now, all of that talk about oneness, all of that exhortation to be one, is rooted in what Paul said in chapter 2 about the work of Christ, where he said Jesus Christ himself is our peace, and the our there is Jews and Gentiles, which were the two groups that were at odds with each other, perhaps more vigorously than anybody else in the first century. Jesus is our peace, who's made us both one, and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments and ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross. So, and then if you add to what Jesus did on the cross, the fact that John 17 tells us that Jesus prays earnestly that the church may be one, not just may get along, but the church may be one the way he and the Father are one, with sort of Trinitarian quality of oneness, then it becomes even more important that we find a way to do it right. If the church can't find a way to work through its differences and still be one without pretending that we all agree, if we can't find a way of doing that, we quote unquote prove to the watching world, and the world is watching the church, that Jesus isn't much of a savior. We prove that the cross didn't really take, and we prove that Jesus doesn't know how to pray. We prove, in other words, that the church is really no different from any other social organization, coming together and dividing for the same reasons that any other social organization does. And that's just not true. The church is going to outlast every social organization in the world. And somehow we have to demonstrate that now, without pretending that we agree with each other. So that's why it's so important.
Well, you know, boy, you said that so very, very well. You know, what's so interesting is that it appears that politics now has successfully divided the church, that all of our tenets of faith have been politicized to the point where it has divided us or polarized us, and then we buy this thing called separation of church and state. So it's easier to do nothing than to do something, or we find churches who are just hammering other churches because they're not involved. I mean, this is a serious moment for the life of the church inside of America as to whether or not we're going to be salt and light.
Right, it is. And maybe if, can I share with you some sort of practical thoughts on how to make it through, because I gave you some big principles just now. I found three distinctions to be very, very helpful. They don't solve everything, but they do help us to find a way. And they are the distinction between theocracy on the one hand and influence on the other, number one. The distinction between moral principle on the one hand and political strategy, number two. And then the distinction between the calling of the church as the church and the calling of individual Christians. And if you don't mind, can I just expand on those three?
Oh, please. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with all three of those.
Okay. So first of all, you have theocracy versus influence. Theocracy tends to identify a particular group or a particular nation or a particular party, a particular platform with what God is up to. And we have to understand that theocracy has ended, or at least it's dramatically changed with the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. There's still a theocracy. Jesus is the king, but he's the king over every tribe and nation, and over every party. He's not identified with any one. Now, and Christians therefore have to believe that, have to really operate out of that in the way they try to behave publicly. Doesn't mean that we never work for legislation, no, but it means we have to ask serious questions about why we do so and so. So anyway, that's theocracy. Then you have influence. Influence is more difficult to define, and in our impatient culture, that's the problem. It's more difficult to identify, but I would describe it as the effort to seek patiently to nudge the culture in the right direction by any number of different means. So whereas theocrats aim to win and they're very results driven, influencers aim to serve and are driven by faithfulness. Influencers buy into the principle of the incarnation. Jesus said, if anyone would be my disciple, he has to deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Jesus incarnated. What that means is he came inside this world as its friend, but he took his orders from the outside. And in the same way, we need to enter political parties, action groups, and so on as friends, but take our orders from the outside, which means we'll never really fit. We'll always be asking serious questions about the group that we're inside of. And it may well work out as we serve in God's providence that something really lovely will happen in the culture. And that would be great. But it may turn out that, in fact, nothing works out and we suffer. But you see, that's okay too, because Jesus suffered and he never promised us we wouldn't suffer. Results for the influencer are not in his hands. Results are in God's hands. So that's theocracy versus influence. The other two I'll say more quickly. That was a long one.
Well, that's okay. I'll tell you what I'm going to do here, Pastor. I'll probably take a break and I'll have you come back, because this is absolutely, you're hitting the nail on the head. And what's so interesting here about what you're saying is that we can be involved as long as we don't make that involvement with that organization the end all. That's just a place to serve.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And it takes some of the heat off when we realize that. We're not in this business to make change happen. Jesus makes the changes happen. We're there to be faithful. But we need to be faithful. We need to work.
It might come to a surprise to a lot of people. I'm hearing you say is that Jesus isn't a Republican.
Yeah, right. That's right. He is a Republican and he isn't a Democrat.
Okay. You are laying down an incredible foundation here, Pastor Drew. So let's go back to, you got 2 more points to make on this, and I want you to pick it up and go for it.
Okay, 2 more distinctions that I have found to be very helpful. Once again, there's no silver bullet here. I think that's one of the mistakes we always make. We think there's some quick solution, and there never is to matters that are important. But I think these other 2 distinctions are helpful. And the first of them is this: a distinction between moral principle and political strategy. The first, moral principle, you find summarized, moral principles, you find summarized in places like the 10 Commandments. Now, it seems to me that the church must unabashedly speak into the culture, to its people, those high moral principles. And we are to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We're to love our neighbors ourselves. We're not to steal. We're not to commit adultery. We're not to bear false witness. We're not to kill. We're not to murder. Those sorts of things, unabashedly, the church needs to come right out and say. But that needs to be distinguished from political strategy. And this is what I mean. The minute you move from that high ground where we say this is God's law, and we as Christians certainly need to be living by it. The minute we move from that to the tricky question of what strategies do we use to nudge the culture in the direction to greater conformity to moral principles, we enter an area where the church, an unclear area, a fallible area. Voting is fallible. It's not perfect. So as one example, we enter a fallible area where the church has an additional obligation. It has an obligation to speak God's law, but it also has an obligation to defend and protect the consciences of its people, not just from the outside world, but from each other, so that nobody in the church ends up feeling like a second-class citizen because he differs on strategy from another Christian in the church. So take abortion. Mm-hmm. I think the church must speak very clearly out about the fact that abortion is killing an innocent life, and it's wrong. It's forbidden. But the question of what do we do practically to try to reduce abortions or push against abortion? Different Christians have different strategies. I mean, one strategy, of course, is to vote into office pro-life people. But there are also pro-life Democrats who say, look, I don't think strategically we're going to get anywhere in overthrowing Roe v. Wade. So my strategy is to vote in people who will build up the social network so that the need for abortions will be reduced among many people. Now, without weighing in on which of those strategies I think is better, because that's not the point in my book, what I'm trying to say is Christians need to talk with each other, argue with each other, lovingly, of course, over which is the best strategy. But in the end, they need to allow their difference. They need to allow themselves to live together. They need to be able to go to the Lord's Supper together after they've had a long argument about what the best strategy is. Same has to do.
Well, there's a point here. Yeah, there's a point here I think is really, really critical, because if we don't allow for that brotherly communication back and forth and respect, we have a tendency to demonize the other person because they're not like us. And they actually become the enemy, and we actually classify them as the enemy of God. Boy, there goes our witness. There goes our evangelism. There just almost goes the reason why we're on the face of this earth.
Right. A great little strategy, a great little takeaway that I would leave with you is that I would encourage anybody who feels very strong about a particular strategy or a particular issue in politics to have a cup of coffee with a Christian who disagrees.
Yeah.
and in an unpressurized setting, and listen. The Lord, one rabbi said, the Lord's given us 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we'll listen twice as much as we speak. So listen, try to look for common ground. Try to find ways, distinguish between moral principle and political strategy, and see, it's very important to kind of sort that out. And look for common ground together. Be friends. And if in the end you just can't agree, then you hug each other, you pray about the moral principle that's at stake, and you go your separate ways. And you show up at church the next Sunday together and have the Lord's Supper together. But anyway, let me move on to the third distinction that I found to be helpful in working things out. Yeah. It's the distinction between the responsibility of, or the callings of the church as the church, and the callings of individual Christians. The callings of individual Christians are tremendously broad and varied, depending upon gifts, training, opportunities, and so on. The callings of the church as the church, I'm talking about, the church in its called responsibilities from Christ, are not that many. And they're critically important, because if the church doesn't do them, nobody else will. One of those is to pray down the kingdom of God upon the earth. Jesus says in the Lord's Prayer to pray that way. And if there's nobody else doing that, nobody else is going to be praying, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And I'm not just saying perfunctory praying. I'm talking about serious, roll up your sleeves, heartfelt, passionate praying for the kingdom to come. If the church doesn't do it, nobody will. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is to make disciples of all nations. Jesus' Great Commission, going into all the world and making disciples of all nations. If the church isn't doing that, nobody's going to do that either. And what happens when churches get too politicized? To get politicized as a church involves an enormous energy drain. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, and it takes the church away from things which, if the church doesn't do them, nobody else will. So those 3 distinctions I have found to be useful. As my church in New York City, wonderfully, surprisingly, has Republicans and Democrats in it. We've had public forums in the church where I've had Republicans and Democrats talk about how they're going to vote and why they are going to vote differently, and then interacted with each other, and then heard questions coming from the floor. And it's modeled for me, proved to me that it's really possible. It's hard. It's possible to do this. Sadly, I hate to say, it's easier in New York where everybody's thrown together. I realize that. But sadly, so many churches are already divided along political lines. The only reason they don't fight is everybody in the church is either Democrat. That's often the case with black churches. Or everyone in the church is Republican. That's often the case with white churches. And so there's no fighting, because they're not together. They've self-selected into churches which are enclaves of a political sort, and that's.
I think if we were to narrow this argument down, it really comes down to 2 issues, and that is probably the abortion issue and the same-sex marriage issues. Those are the 2 polarizing issues that the church seemingly divides the most over, or can't get a handle on to attract maybe a young girl who has gone through the stain of an abortion. They don't see the church as a safe place to come get healed from that. And the same-sex marriage issue, we don't see the homosexual as a broken child that needs God's love. We just see them as a person who needs to be condemned because they're doing something that's so aberrant from creation. So we really haven't come up with an antidote to get along on these issues, and it seems like we're divided right down those 2 things. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the distinction between strategy and moral principle is helpful. In other words, I think it's very difficult to say, if you're a Bible-based church, that God doesn't prefer heterosexual, monogamous, lifetime union for how marriages are supposed to function. And it's very difficult, if you're faithful to Scripture, to get around the fact that abortion is killing, and therefore forbidden in the Ten Commandments.
Mm-hmm.
I think I think Christians need to sort of agree on those things, but the strategies are different, and I think there needs to be a willingness, really, truly, to allow different people to embrace different strategies. So for example, on the gay marriage thing, some people in certain situations may feel that passing a law of some sort or an amendment of some sort that makes it very, very clear what marriage is supposed to look like is really the best way to go. But there may be Christians in other settings altogether who understand and believe in traditional marriage, but who feel as though that's not the best way to go. That maybe a better way to go is to not press a political agenda, but welcome homosexuals in their church, make sure their own heterosexual marriages are decent. The problem in so much of the church is that the quote-unquote ideal marriages are not ideal at all, and it's not, the testimony isn't very winsome with respect to God's best plan. So again, I'm not telling you where I come out on this. What I'm saying is that the way to be together in the church is to be able to say, there really are different strategies for trying to address these issues that trouble us.
Do you think part of our problem is patience? We just don't have the patience to mentor or disciple people who are wavering on these issues. In other words, they may be new to the church. They may be new Christians. They're not mature. We're just not cutting them any slack to maybe mature in their faith to see the differences.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's why that passage in Ephesians 4 is so important, with patience and humility, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. We're pushing so hard towards a quick fix, and we identify different ones among us to identify that fix in different ways, that we aren't patient. We're not willing to listen. I think, actually, if I may, let me say another thing about what that will help with the patience. I think it's very important to broaden our understanding of public life. For many Christians in this increasingly polarized world, public life is defined as power politics. Well, that's a pretty frustrating definition mm-hmm. because very few people are ever in power, and if they get in power, they're out of the next election. Yeah. So, and political power is actually much more limited than we think. If we define our involvement in public life as more broadly as living our lives out as public Christians, not simply as power politics Christians. Right. I think it takes a little bit of the heat off because we can be public Christians in ways that aren't defined by power, by making public goodness attractive, by the arts, by prayer, by praying for the kingdom, all those sorts of things. I think that will help to defuse things a bit.
Well, I commend you for taking this on. I realize this is a huge thing. I have a son who's a state senator. I've been a leader of a political party statewide for quite a few years, and I can tell you that the greatest heat I got were from fellow believers, that I wasn't this enough, I wasn't that enough, I wasn't this enough, and all of a sudden you realize, there's no way you can do this because at the end of the day you got all your supposed supporters mad at you. Yeah. I don't know what to do,
we are so cynical towards our political leaders, and I talk about that in the book. It is really hard to be in politics.
It really is.
And I think we need to cut people who have the guts enough to be in politics. We need to cut them a break. We need to pray for them. We need to write them letters, and anytime they do something that we're grateful for, write them a letter and say thank you.
Well, thank you. Again, the book is entitled Body Broken, Can Republicans and Democrats Sit in the Same Pew by Charles D. Drew. There's a picture of it there on the screen. Let me encourage you to check it out at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, or you can go to newgrowthpress.com and check it out there. And Pastor, thank you. You're gutsy.
Well, I felt compelled to do this, so I've done it.
Oh, hey, thanks. And let's stay in touch and see how this goes as we get on the other side of this election cycle, okay?
Oh, sure enough.
All right,
Good to talk.
all right, God bless you. Thanks for being with us.
God bless you too. Yeah, bye.